things like that. And she was sacked because they thought her husband had given it to the press.
There were very few complaints as far as I remember. I think if they'd have been really pissed off, you know, I'd have been bashing on my door saying what's going on. There were 1 or 2 complaints. But no, I think they were fabulous, these girls. I mean, what they had to do.
It was chaos. I had a dancer friend who came to work in the crowd or something at the end of the film, and she just looked around and she said, oh, it's terrible. She said, it's chaotic. Well, that was Ken's, I would imagine, his whole point, that it was a community gone berserk.
The newspapers were full of it. All this terrible film that was being made at Pinewood, and how these evil things were happening. The moment you produce a woman's tit on the screen, the people in the film just go mad. They start closing sets and locking doors, and they go around sneakily, and they get all kind of prurient. And I mean, in The Devils, there was a long wall in a section in the cathedral of painted canvas, and they split a split in it about 20 or 30 feet long, so they're all getting their knees.
It definitely sort of whipped up or encouraged people to get into a frenzy, because that was what the scene was all about.
Russell never even hedges his bets. He never even sets up an ambiguity, because at every point when it seems as if this really is or could be a supernatural possession, as if Grandier could have the mark of the devil, there's an undercutting line.
It was night. He came into my room smiling.
Name him.
I cannot, it was dark.
Was he alone?
No, 6 of his creatures were with him.
For instance, when Vanessa Redgrave first describes the sort of the lustful congress that she has had after the fantasies early on, when she actually tells that to the Baron turns aside.
This is nothing. This public exorcism was a mistake. Let's stop it now before we become the laughingstock of the entire town.
I also felt that I was being guided by an unseen hand, as though this film is very important. It's got to be told properly. And I felt that, yes, it's working. Certainly from an aesthetic point of view, it's going to be a very successful film. I think I was aware right from the start that it was going to be a controversial one, but knowing what Ken's attitude was to being very graphic, I took that in its stride.
Aware that he was making a controversial film, Ken Russell showed a rough cut of The Devils to Chief Censor John Trevelyan, who made some unofficial suggestions for cuts from material which he felt may predispose his colleagues at the BBFC to ban the film outright.
John Trevelyan was a garrulous old fella. Loved to name drop. The name he dropped most of all was Ken Russell.
Well, as I understand it, there was a showing of the film not at the board, but outside when Lord Harley and John Trevelyan saw it, so that after that screening, John told us that it would be a very difficult film for us to see.
John, I think, was a courageous censor in some ways, that he realized times were changing and you had to change with them. But I don't think that John was prepared to be brought along in the accelerated rush of Ken Russell's idea of change.
It was a sort of very friendly conversation, you know, in which he'd say, Ken, I'm afraid I'm going to cut your throat. I'll not cut you. Cut your best scene, you know, but don't take it against me because that's my job, lad.
Well, it's my opinion that if the film had gone out in its original cut as we saw it, it would have been subject to the Obscene Publications Act. I think legal action could have been taken against it. And one of the roles of the BBFC, of course, is to protect the industry from that kind of action taking place. The board is not there to deny the public seeing what it wants to see, but we really did feel in this case it could have led to trouble.
Yes, John Trevelyan, I think, really did realise the film as, you know, was a worthy attempt at portraying an actual event in an artistic way, not a documentary way. But he knew his colleagues just wouldn't stand for it, and I think some would
wanted to ban the entire film, so I suppose in a way we're lucky to get away with what we did.
Following his BBC films on the various composers, his work struck us as very extreme. The Music Lovers was quite a difficult film, particularly one sequence where Glenda Jackson is on a grating and she's being groped from below, so that we knew any Russell film that was coming in was going to prove difficult.
I actually met him through John Trevelyan, who was a great friend of mine. Isn't surprising, since he was the British censor and I'm a Catholic priest, and I was involved in the Legion of Decency in New York, which was not a state operation, just an operation of the Catholic Church, but it did have a lot of influence. And John Trevelyan would always ask me how a film was going to be treated by the Legion, and that gave him a little bit of a notion of what problems he might have with the film in England.
Most significantly, Trevelyan told Russell to lose The Rape of Christ, which was already causing consternation elsewhere, and which the chief censor now insisted should be dropped in its entirety.
Since I saw the film for the first time with that in there, to me it's always been there. And although I saw the film subsequently when it was released commercially without that scene, I still remember it as being there. My point is this: if I had seen the film without the scene for the first time, and then it were put in, it might have seemed like an interpolation. But since, in my memory, it's always been there, I simply cannot imagine the film without it.
Now, for Russell, this scene was the thematic climax of the film, juxtaposing scenes of nuns tearing down and ravishing a life-size icon of Christ with scenes of Grandier taking a simple communion by a roadside, creating a jarring disparity between the growing purity of his faith and the abhorrent depravity of their charade.
We ran the film in a fairly large preview theatre in Mayfair. Roy Baird, Ken and I sat at the back, and these men had got a secretary with a notebook and a reading lamp with them, and within 10 minutes of the beginning of the running, heads were sort of conferring and the light was going on and notes were being taken, and we were sort of thinking, what on earth can they have an objection to at this point? And the conferring got more and more until by the time we got to the burning of Grandier, Roy Baird just leaned over to Ken and myself and said, let's get out of here and go and have a drink. So we crept out of the theatre in the dark and left them to have nobody to argue with when the lights went up.
They were very upset about it afterwards, and consequently they were rather ashamed of it.
Although they'd had the script and I actually shot the script, there was nothing in the finished film that wasn't in the script, and they were appalled by it.
He said, if you read Aldous Huxley's book on the Devil's Louis Dawn, you can filter what goes on in that story in your mind as you want. But when the filmmaker puts that on film, then it's out there very much in detail and very vivid.
Maybe they just had readers saying, yeah, this is an old historical romance, no problem.
And it was simply a question of their not imagining what it was going to be like when they read it.
And I guess it just hit them between the eyes or between the legs, and doubled them up.
We all took against the film, I must be absolutely honest about that. Although we realised it was a very fine piece of filmmaking, we did think initially that it might even be rejected, because everything appeared to be to excess. I don't think we considered that a film from Ken Russell would be rejected, but obviously we had to consider all the options.
If one believes, as I do, that truly important and significant cinema should enthrall and enrage in pretty much equal measure, then it seems clear that The Devils has done its work, both on its original release in the early 1970s and still to this day.
Well, my reactions to it were incorporated in my review in the Evening Standard, which appeared on the 22nd of July, 1971.
Well, Alex Walker, obviously, you know, hated the film apparently and gave it a bad review, and mentioned 2 incidents in the film that were just figments of his imagination.
The BBC, rather late in the day, had sniffed the sound of battle, I think, upon reading my review, and had issued speedy invitations to us both to appear in the late-night news programme.
And I confronted him with these 2 lies, and he just wouldn't answer when I said, you know, this didn't happen. You know, you made it up, didn't you? Admit it. Here's your review.